Venezuela has just signed an agreement that is shattering decades of American oil dominance in South America and redefining the future of global energy markets. On January 5th, 2026, Caracas finalized a joint venture giving Russia's Rosneft operational control over the Orinoco Belt, the world's largest proven oil reserve. This isn't a symbolic partnership. We're talking about 260 billion barrels of crude oil now directly managed by Moscow, with China's state oil giant CNPC joining as a strategic investor. What's happening behind this decision is the collapse of the petrodollar enforcement system that Washington spent 70 years building across Latin America. This move doesn't just shift Venezuela's oil revenue away from Western markets. It creates a fully independent supply chain running from Caracas to Shanghai, bypassing every American financial checkpoint, every sanction mechanism, every pressure point that was designed to keep Venezuelan oil under indirect Western control. For the United States, this represents the loss of leverage over the continent's most resource-rich nation at the exact moment when global oil prices are climbing and strategic reserves are being deployed to stabilize domestic fuel costs. But here's what the mainstream coverage isn't explaining. Why now? Why would Venezuela, a country that Washington has spent 2 decades trying to regime change, suddenly formalize what amounts to a complete handover of its energy sovereignty to powers that directly oppose American interests? What shifted in the balance of power that made this not only possible, but inevitable? The answer requires us to go back not to the sanctions of 2019, not even to the Chavez era. We need to understand how American control over Venezuelan oil was established in the first place and why that control is now collapsing in real time. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to 1976, the year Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and created Petróleos de Venezuela, known as PDVSA. On paper, this was full sovereignty. Venezuelan oil, Venezuelan profits, Venezuelan control, but the reality was far more complex. The United States had spent decades embedding itself into Venezuela's oil infrastructure. American engineering firms built the refineries. American financial institutions managed the export contracts. American oil companies retained service agreements that gave them de facto operational influence even after nationalization. By the 1,990 seconds, this system had crystallized into what economists called the apertura petrolera, the opening of Venezuelan oil to foreign investment. Under this framework, international companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips held profit-sharing agreements that allowed them to extract Venezuelan crude while Caracas collected royalties. It looked like partnership. It functioned as extraction. The heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt required advanced refining technology that only Western companies possessed. Venezuela had the reserves. America had the refineries. This created a dependency loop that locked Venezuelan oil into the U.S. market. For decades, this arrangement was stable. Venezuela sent over 1 million barrels per day to American refineries on the Gulf Coast. The revenue flowed back to Caracas, minus the cut taken by American firms, banks, and service contractors. Washington didn't need to invade. It didn't need military bases on Venezuelan soil. Economic architecture was enough. The oil had to flow north. The dollars had to cycle through New York. The contracts had to be enforced under U.S. legal jurisdiction. This was structural control. Then Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. His government began renegotiating the terms. Higher royalties, greater state control, limits on foreign profit repatriation. By 2007, Chavez had forced ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips out of the country entirely when they refused new contract terms. This was the first crack. Washington responded with financial pressure. International arbitration courts ruled that Venezuela owed billions in compensation. Credit ratings were downgraded, investment dried up. The message was clear. You can nationalize your oil, but you cannot escape the financial system that monetizes it. For decades, this system seemed unshakable, but something changed. Between 2014 and 2019, global oil prices collapsed, Venezuela's economy went into freefall, and the United States saw an opening. Sanctions were imposed, first targeting individuals in the Maduro government, then entire sectors of the economy, and finally, in 2019, the oil industry itself. The explicit goal was regime change. Cut off Venezuela's oil revenue, collapse the government, install a pro-Western leadership, and restore American firms to their previous position. It didn't work. What happened instead was that Venezuela, facing total exclusion from Western financial markets, turned east, not as a rhetorical pivot, as a survival strategy. Russia and China stepped in with oil-backed loans, infrastructure investment, and technical assistance. These weren't charity deals. Moscow and Beijing were acquiring long-term claims on Venezuelan oil exports, positioning themselves to replace American influence entirely. And on January 5th, 2026, that positioning became formalized operational control. Here's what actually happened. The agreement signed in Caracas grants Rosneft and CNPC joint operational authority over 4 major production blocks in the Orinoco Belt. These blocks represent roughly 40% of Venezuela's total extraction capacity. Rosneft will manage refining upgrades and export logistics. CNPC will finance infrastructure expansion and provide drilling technology for deep reserves that PDVSA lacked the capital to access. In exchange, Russia and China receive a guaranteed supply of discounted crude priced in yuan and rubles with no dollar transactions at any point in the supply chain. This is not a lease. This is not a service contract. This is operational control. Russian engineers are on site. Chinese financial auditors are managing revenue flows. Venezuelan officials retained legal ownership, but the day-to-day decisions over extraction rates, export destinations, and pricing structures are now made in Moscow and Beijing. The official statement from PDVSA described it as a strategic partnership to modernize the energy sector. What it actually represents is the final collapse of American leverage over Venezuelan oil. Why did this happen now? 3 factors converged. First, U.S. sanctions failed to collapse the Maduro government, but succeeded in destroying PDVSA's operational capacity. Production dropped from 3 million barrels per day in 2014 to under 700,000 barrels per day by 2025. The industry was crippled. Venezuela needed massive capital investment to rebuild, and that capital was only available from Moscow and Beijing. Second, global oil markets shifted. The 2025 energy crisis in Europe, driven by the collapse of North Sea production and continued disruptions from the war in Ukraine, sent prices above $120 per barrel. At that price point, even Venezuela's heavy crude became highly profitable. Russia, facing its own production limits due to sanctions, saw an opportunity to control a secondary supply source. China, importing over 12 million barrels per day, wanted guaranteed reserves outside the Persian Gulf. Venezuela became the perfect target. Third, the geopolitical climate changed. The expansion of BRICS, the increasing use of non-dollar trade mechanisms, and the weakening of U.S. sanctions enforcement created space for this kind of agreement. 10 years ago, a deal like this would have triggered immediate financial retaliation. In 2026, Washington's options are limited. Sanctioning Russia and China over Venezuelan oil is functionally meaningless. They're already sanctioned. Cutting Venezuela off further only pushes them deeper into the Russian-Chinese orbit. But there's something more important that traditional media is not reporting. This wasn't a sudden decision made in response to immediate economic pressure. Documents leaked from the Venezuelan Ministry of Energy reveal that this framework was negotiated over a 2-year period beginning in late 2023. Russia and China didn't just offer money, they offered something Washington could never provide: immunity from Western financial coercion. Venezuela's oil revenue had been frozen in American and European banks. Over $8 billion in assets were seized. Every dollar earned from oil exports had to pass through the SWIFT system, where it could be blocked at any time. What Moscow and Beijing offered was a parallel financial infrastructure. Russian banks handled transactions. Chinese ports received shipments. Yuan-based payments settled in Shanghai. At no point did a dollar change hands. At no point did the transaction pass through a Western-controlled financial node. This wasn't just an oil deal. It was the construction of an entirely separate economic operating system designed to function outside American reach. And here's the hidden dimension. Venezuela is not alone in making this calculation. Leaked communications between PDVSA officials and state oil companies in Iran, Algeria, and Nigeria show that similar frameworks are under discussion. The Venezuelan model is being studied as a template if you are an oil-producing nation currently under sanctions, or threatened with future sanctions, or simply tired of the terms imposed by Western energy companies. This agreement shows there is an alternative. You can trade your oil outside the dollar system. You can finance your industry without Western banks. You can operate outside the enforcement mechanisms that Washington has relied on for decades. This is where the story gets really interesting, because what we're witnessing is not just one country making one deal. It's the emergence of a coordinated strategy among sanctioned and non-aligned states to build redundant systems that bypass American financial infrastructure. The Venezuela, Russia, China oil arrangement is the energy component. The BRICS payment system is the financial component. The Belt and Road Initiative is the logistics component. These are interlocking pieces of a structure designed to create a parallel global economy. What comes next is crucial. The United States now faces a strategic dilemma. Does it escalate sanctions further, knowing that doing so will only accelerate the shift toward alternative systems? Or does it accept that its leverage over global energy markets has been fundamentally diminished? The Biden administration's initial response has been muted. A State Department spokesperson called the deal concerning and said the U.S. would monitor the situation. That's diplomatic language for we have no effective countermove. Meanwhile, Russia gains a foothold in South America that it hasn't had since the Cold War, not through military bases, through energy infrastructure. Rosneft's control over Venezuelan oil gives Moscow influence over supply to the Caribbean, Central America, and parts of the U.S. Gulf Coast that still rely on heavy crude imports. This is strategic depth. If tensions escalate between Russia and the West, Moscow now has the ability to disrupt energy flows in America's backyard. China's position is even more significant. By securing a direct stake in Venezuelan production, Beijing reduces its dependence on Middle Eastern oil that must pass through U.S.-patrolled shipping lanes, the South China Sea, the Strait of Hormuz. These choke points have always been a vulnerability for Chinese energy security. Venezuelan oil shipped across the Pacific bypasses those risks entirely. This is long-term strategic planning. China is not just buying oil. It's buying immunity from a potential U.S. naval blockade. At this point, I need to step back from emotion and look at this through a realist lens. What we're seeing is a textbook example of great power competition in the realm of energy security. When a hegemonic power uses economic coercion as its primary tool of influence, and when that coercion fails to achieve its objectives, adversarial powers will fill the vacuum. This is not ideology. This is not about democracy or authoritarianism. This is about the rational behavior of states pursuing their security interests in an anarchic international system. The United States used sanctions to try to force a government change in Venezuela. That policy failed, but the sanctions remained in place, which meant Venezuela had no pathway back to Western markets, even if it wanted one. From a realist perspective, Caracas had no choice but to align with powers willing to offer an alternative. Russia and China, facing their own exclusion from Western systems, had every incentive to provide that alternative. The result was inevitable, not because of anyone's values, because of the structure of power and the distribution of incentives. This is the framework that explains why this deal happened. States act to maximize their security and their autonomy. When one state uses economic leverage to try to control another, and when that controlled state finds a way to escape that leverage, it will take it. Venezuela lost access to Western oil markets. It gained access to Eastern markets. In realist terms, it traded one dependency for another. But from Caracas's perspective, dependency on Moscow and Beijing is preferable to dependency on Washington because Moscow and Beijing are not currently trying to overthrow the government. The question now is whether other states will follow the same logic, and all evidence indicates that they will. Iran has already expanded its oil for goods barter system with China, bypassing sanctions entirely. Russia itself has restructured its energy exports to favor India and China over Europe. Saudi Arabia is negotiating yuan-denominated oil sales. These are not isolated events. They are part of a broader pattern. States are actively constructing alternatives to the dollar-based energy trade system because that system has been weaponized. This isn't just about Venezuela. The consequences will affect energy prices, currency stability, and the enforcement power of U.S. foreign policy for the next decade. For the entire region, this move signals that alignment with Washington is no longer the only viable option. Countries that were on the fence, watching to see if sanctions would break Venezuela, now have their answer. Sanctions did not break Venezuela. They pushed it into a new alliance structure that is now operational and profitable. The international financial system faces a fragmentation that was previously theoretical. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency has always depended on its necessity for purchasing oil. If major oil producers begin selling in yuan and rubles, that necessity weakens. We're not talking about the collapse of the dollar. We're talking about the erosion of its monopoly. Every percentage point of global oil trade that shifts away from dollar settlement reduces the structural demand for dollars. That has implications for U.S. debt, inflation, and the ability to finance government spending through currency issuance. In the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see more energy producers adopt similar frameworks. The Venezuela model proves it can be done. It proves that Russia and China have the financial and logistical capacity to support it. And it proves that U.S. sanctions, while painful, are not insurmountable. The unipolar moment where American financial power could dictate terms globally is closing. What replaces it is a multipolar energy market where producers have options and buyers have competition. This means that prices for oil in Western markets will become more volatile. When supply chains fragment, price signals become less efficient. If Venezuelan oil is locked into contracts with Russia and China. It's not available to stabilize prices in the US or Europe. That reduces the buffer that global spare capacity used to provide. The next oil shock will hit harder because the market is less integrated, and integration was the mechanism that allowed Washington to manage prices through strategic reserves and diplomatic pressure on producers. For the entire Western Hemisphere, this move represents a geopolitical realignment. Venezuela was supposed to be in the U.S. sphere of influence. Its oil was supposed to flow north. Its politics was supposed to bend toward Washington's preferences. That assumption is now obsolete. And if Venezuela can exit that sphere, other countries will calculate whether they can do the same. We're already seeing it. Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba. These are small economies, but they're testing the limits of U.S. tolerance. If the cost of defiance is manageable, more defiance will follow. The long-term consequences extend to military planning. The U.S. Navy has structured its global presence around the assumption that it can control energy choke points and protect the sea lanes that carry oil to allied nations. If those nations start sourcing oil from suppliers who ship to different ports using different routes, the value of U.S. naval protection decreases. This doesn't mean the Navy becomes irrelevant. It means the leverage that naval dominance provided starts to erode. And leverage is what allows a superpower to translate military strength into political outcomes. Venezuela has demonstrated that resource-rich states can survive sustained economic warfare if they are willing to accept alternative partnerships and restructure their trade flows accordingly. What we're witnessing is not a temporary deviation from the rules-based international order, but the emergence of a parallel order with different rules, different enforcement mechanisms, and different power centers. As the global system fragments into competing blocks, the ability of any single state to impose its will universally diminishes. This move marks the moment when U.S. control over South American oil formally ended, not through military defeat, not through diplomatic negotiation, through the quiet construction of alternative systems that made that control irrelevant. The unipolar world is fracturing, and Venezuela is positioning itself in the new multipolar reality, not as a vassal of Washington, but as a partner of Moscow and Beijing. The oil still flows, the money still moves, but the infrastructure that moves it is no longer under American oversight, and that changes everything.